My name is Jennifer Fleeger. I'm an associate professor at Ursinus College, where I teach film studies. My film recommendation this week is 1998 movie Smoke Signals. I decided to introduce it sitting here at the desk where I homeschool my son at the moment. And initially I made that decision because I didn't have a lot of time to do a really well edited introduction this week because of having to homeschool him, and so I thought I'd sit here as kind of a joke about that. And then I thought, well, it's also nice to sit here to make visible the kind of invisible labor that a lot of women and other people are having to do right now as a result of the pandemic. But then I realized that there's actually a connection between how I'm teaching my son and how I often like to teach this film in my courses at Ursinus. When I decided to teach my son history, I looked at this book, Howard Zinn's Young People's History of the United States, which takes aim at how us white people have often been taught about American history, and particularly the role of indigenous people in shaping our history. And this is the same thing that I like to do with Smoke Signals, because if you look at Smoke Signals, if you have the time, perhaps, to revisit John Ford's The Searchers, alongside this movie, both of them are road movies or quest films about a masculine quest to solve some problem or achieve some goal. And yet they use the idea of whiteness and Native American characters very, very differently. Not that The Searchers is necessarily a bad film, but rather it's interesting to see the way in which we have been taught and socialized to look at Native Americans as white people, and then how we might look at this film. Smoke Signals was the first major film with wide distribution to have been directed, produced, written by, and with a majority of Native American and First Nation peoples in the cast and the crew. So it's worth thinking about the framing and the authorship of these two movies back to back. Smoke Signals a couple of years ago was accepted to the National Film Registry by the Library of Congress for it being aesthetically and culturally and historically important. And it's also a very funny film, so I think you'll enjoy it even without its cultural value and all of those things. It's hilarious. It's a movie directed by Chris Iyer. Chris Iyer has since directed many other films and television programs. He has served a couple of years ago, and I want to get the title right, so I'm going to read it, as Distinguished Chair in Democratic Ideals at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So he's held a lot of important positions and given a number of interesting talks, in addition to being a very active and good director on top of all that. The film stars many excellent actors, who I've printed pictures out to talk about them. The first of them is Adam Beach. You may have seen Adam Beach in Wind Talkers or Flags of Our Fathers. He also continues to play roles on television. And he's Canadian. He grew up on the Lake Manitoba Dog Creek First Nation Reserve. It also stars Evan Adams. Evan Adams looks a little bit different in the film with his braids. He plays the character of Thomas. And he's also Canadian. He's from British Columbia. He won the Independent Spirit Award for Best Debut Performance for this movie. And he actually became a medical doctor, quite a renowned one. He's now Chief Medical Officer of the First Nations Health Authority in Canada. And he's also written many plays. It also stars Gary Farmer, who plays the father. You may recognize him if you've seen Jim Jarmusch's Western Dead Man. He plays nobody in that film. He also appeared in Jarmusch's Ghost Dog. And he is the founder of Aboriginal Voices Radio Network in Canada and has a blues band. And finally, Irene Bedard stars as a friend of the father in the movie. She is from Alaska. She plays Susie Song in the film. She has Inuit and Cree ancestry, and she went to the university here at Philadelphia, to the University of the Arts. You may recognize her voice. She's the speaking voice of Pocahontas in the Disney film, and she was also the physical model for Pocahontas for that movie. She continues to act in film and television today. There are a number of things to consider and to look for when watching Smoke Signals, even though it's a fairly straightforward, seemingly comedic American independent film production. There is a lot of complexity going on in this movie. First of all, one big theme that runs through a lot of Sherman Alexie's work is the idea of Indians watching Indians, as they refer to it in the film. And one of the books he wrote, Indian Killer, refers to this specifically. I just want to read this passage. He's talking about a character who was adopted as a young man. When John imagines his birth, his mother is sometimes Navajo. Other times she's Lakota. Often she's from the same tribe as the last Indian woman he has seen on television. This idea that Native people get their identity from images made of them and representations in the world runs through this movie. So it's something that you can look for and think about. And it's part of the way that Smoke Signals tries to reclaim the stereotypes about Native Americans in a film made by Native Americans. Part of that reclamation is the second thing that you might want to look for, which is what is beautiful. This film makes the reservation look beautiful. It makes the landscape of Idaho and Arizona and everything in between look quite beautiful. And it does this with long takes where the camera's on for a long time, and high angle shots where you can really see the scenery and the places that the bus is going. So thinking about the relationship between how Chris Iyer is filming American landscapes and how John Ford might have filmed American landscapes is also quite a productive thing that you may wish to do. Music is important to the movie as well. There's a lot of popular music used in the film, popular songs that are used as commentaries on the action in rather comedic and nice ways. But there are also two other elements of music that it's worth thinking about. One, the radio. The way the radio plays in this film, it begins very near the film. We see the radio station and the guy who reports on the traffic and the weather standing at one of the crossroads. And this is quite funny, and it works to bind the community together. And this is a kind of popular theme in American cinema. We see it in American Graffiti. If you've seen that movie, the way the radio station and Wolfman Jack plays over everybody's car stereos in that film. It's also prominent in Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, where the radio station unites the block and comments on the activities of the block. So I think Chris Iyer is working with that history of the radio in American cinema when he uses it in Smoke Signals. And finally, another thing to look for technically is the use of lighting. There's a lot of natural lighting because a lot of the shots take place outdoors, but there's one scene in particular where lighting I think is particularly poetic. And that's a scene where the father and son are playing basketball together. And we see the use of backlighting on the father connecting a story from the past to an image in the more recent past. The way that the father is shot and backlit in those scenes, making him into a rather angelic silhouette that actually contrasts with the figure who has the actual qualities that this father really had. Because this is a Forgive the Father film. And I think for some of us that resonates better than with others. And it also resonates in a much more complicated way because of recent accusations against Sherman Alexie, the author of the screenplay for this film. Sherman Alexie, who you may also know, especially if you have children and have read with them the absolutely true Diary of the Part-Time Indian, which is a semi-autobiographical novel. It's very funny and good. He won the National Book Award for this book, and that was rescinded because of the allegations of sexual misconduct against him, credible allegations for which he has at least partially apologized. Anytime we have a character like this who comes up in conversations about the Me Too movement, the work of that character becomes much more complicated. I think studying Smoke Signals, because of all the participation of everybody else involved in this film, I would feel ashamed not to study it because of the accusations against Alexie, because of the work that went into it and the importance that the film has. At the same time, it's worth thinking about why the Forgive the Father narrative is so important to Alexie, given the role that he's played in rather negative shaping of some Native women writers' careers, and of course of actual acts that he did that are rather unforgivable. Finally, the film asks an extremely important question, and I think this is really the main question of the film, which is this: which is more important to us, a great story or the truth? The film begins with a shot of fire and a fantastic story that throughout the movie we take to be true. And it ends with images of water and a kind of poetic speculation about the future that may or may not be true. So with this kind of bookending, and the way that we've been emphasizing in our daily lives, and for very good reason, the value of truth right now, it might be a strange time to ask about the value of stories and the value of good stories. But thinking to ourselves about how we have accepted certain stories about American history and particular people in the American past, and how we accept stories about our personal lives, which stories in the film the characters share with the camera, and which stories they actually keep from each other and why, it's a good question that we can ask in all kinds of scenarios. What do we want to believe, a good story or the truth, and when? So I hope you'll join Andrew and I to discuss smoke signals on Monday. I hope you'll take the time to watch it, again, if you had seen it already, and for the first time if you hadn't. And I'll see you then online. Bye.